Let me ask you about Alex Epstein. So he wrote, I'm not sure if you're familiar who he is,
Yeah.
but he wrote a couple of books. It's just interesting to ask a question about fossil fuels because we're talking about reality. And he's somebody that doesn't just talk about the reality of fossil fuels, but he wrote a book, Moral Case for Fossil Fuels and Fossil Future, where he makes the case that, as his subtitle says, global human flourishing requires oil, coal, and natural gas, or more oil, coal, and natural gas, not less. What do you think about the argument he makes? So he pushes. We've had this kind of, speaking of the center, of this balanced discussion of the reality of fossil fuels, but also investing a lot into renewable energy and that having the $1 to $11 return.
Sure.
But he says, like, well, I'm not sure exactly how to frame it, but like investing and maintaining investment to fossil fuels also has a positive return
yeah.
because of how efficient the energy is.
I've read the first book. Yeah, I haven't read, I've got his second one. I've been planning to have him on my webcast, my tiny webcast. No,
What's the name of the webcast?
Sustain what? Everything I do is sustain what? Because it's like, don't talk to me about sustainability. Sustain what? For whom? How? Then we're talking, interrogatory approach to things. So I think the valuable part of what he has done is to remind people, particularly in the West or North or whatever, the developed world, that everything we take for granted, low fertilizer prices to air conditioning to everything else, exists because we had this bounty that we dug out of the ground or pumped out of the ground. It's a boon. It's been an amazing boon to society, period. So start there, which means going forward, what we're talking about is a substitution or having your fossil fuels and eating it too, meaning getting rid of the carbon dioxide. If you focus on the carbon dioxide, which is the thing warming the planet, not the burning of the fuels, then that's another way forward that could sustain fossil fuels. As far as I can tell from at least the first book, he makes the moral case that fossil fuels are essentially a good overall. I don't think he adequately accounts for the need to stop global warming. I think that we have to slowing global warming is a fundamental need in this century we're in. And that's just not factored into his math.
Well, I think that's where, and I've had a few sort of offline conversation with him. I think he said, because I mentioned I'm talking to the two of you, he said that that's probably where he disagrees about sort of the level of threat that global warming causes.
Well, Steve Koonin is another one. He's a brilliant guy. He lived right close to me in the Hudson Valley. He was in the Obama administration energy department. It's Koonin. He wrote a bestseller that came out recently on skepticism about climate. There are other smart people who somehow feel we can literally adapt our way forward without any constraint on the gases changing the climate. And I've spent enough time on this. I think I'm a pretty level-headed reporter when it comes to this issue. And I think having some sense that we can adapt our way into the world we're building through relentless climate change with no new normal. Remember, more gas accumulating in the air every year. These are not static moments. That's a good thing to do doesn't strike me as smart.
I'd probably say that I think it's more sort of at least the thing that I take away from Alex is the fact, as you point out, that we need to recognize that fossil fuels is basically the backbone of our society today. We get 80% of our energy from fossil fuels today.
Still, as we did 50 years ago, 40 years ago.
Yeah. And people have no sense of this, right? No. So they have the idea, because you see so many wind turbines and solar panels and everybody's talking about it, that this is huge, big things. But the reality is, remember, only about a fifth of all energy use is electricity. The rest is, in processes and heating, industrial processes, and so on. So actually, solar and wind right now produces 1% of energy from wind and 0.8% from solar. This is not a huge thing. It's a fairly tiny bit. Now,
and growing explosively. But
it's absolutely growing. But actually, it's growing slower than what nuclear was growing in the 70s and 80s, which I thought was a fun point. Not by a little amount, by like 2 or 3 times. So we're still talking about something which is somewhat boutique at least. And when you then look out into the future, and I think this is the interesting part of it, when you look out into the future, if you look at the Biden administration's own estimate of what will happen by 2050, we will be at, if all countries do all the stuff that they promised and everything, we will be at 70% fossil fuels by 2050 globally. This is just, yes, it's a better world. I think it's good that we're now down to 70 instead of 80, but it is still a world that's fundamentally dependent on fossil fuels for almost everything that we really like about the world. And forgetting that, and I think we are doing that in the sense, as you also mentioned, that people say no fossil fuels, and we're in all development organizations, we're now telling the poor countries you can't get any funding for anything that has to do with fossil fuels. We have literally reduced our investment in oil and gas by more than half since 2014, and much of this is because of climate concerns. This has real world consequences. This is why energy prices have gone up. It's not the only reason. COVID also, certainly the war in Ukraine, but this is an underlying systemic reason why fossil fuel costs will go up dramatically. Now, a lot of Greens will sort of tend to say, well, that's great because, we want fossil fuels to be expensive. We want people to be forced over to renewables. But that's very easy to say if you're rich. It's the kind of thing that New Yorkers will say, when you go to rich, well-meaning green New Yorkers and say, yes, gasoline should cost $20 a gallon. Well, you don't have a car. You just ride the metro. It's very easy for you to say that. But lots of people, both in the rich world, but in poor parts of the U.S., but all around the world, their lives are basically dependent on fossil fuels. And so the idea that we're going to get people off by making it so expensive that it becomes impossible for them to live good lives is almost morally reprehensible. And I think Alex has the right point there. We need to get people to realize we're not going to get off fossil fuels anytime soon. So we need reasonably affordable fossil fuels for most of the world. And that's, of course, why we need to focus so much more on the innovation so that we can get to the point where we no longer need fossil fuels as soon as possible. But to say to everyone, look, we're going to make fossil fuels expensive way before we have the solution is just terrible.
And so much is on the rich countries of the world. I did a conversation recently with Johan Rockström, who's a famed sustainability scientist in Stockholm. Actually, Potsdam now.
Right.
And he's come up with the idea of planetary boundaries. There are lots of things he has said that I, as a journalist, I'm still looking into about that.
Planetary boundaries?
Yeah, that there are limits to what Earth can absorb in our use of water, phosphorus, or carbon dioxide loading in the atmosphere. There are these boundaries. If we cross them, we're in a hot zone, a danger zone.
Right.
He's an interesting thinker. But on this point, last year at the Glasgow climate talks, he gave a very important talk about the equity thing here. He basically laid out a landscape saying the rich nations of the world need to greatly ramp up their reduction of emissions or what they're going to pay poor countries to do, to allow poor countries, some of which have fossil resources, like in Africa, to have the carbon space to own whatever space or time is left to be able to develop their fossil fuels as a fundamental right. Because also they're starting from this little baseline. Ghana hasn't contributed squat to the global warming problem in terms of emissions. Ghana has natural gas. And right now, this month, the environmental groups are outside the World Bank tonight, saying this was on their list of dirty projects. The World Bank should stop financing Ghana's right to get gas out of the ground, to develop its economy, get its people less poor, make them more productive, innovative parts of humanity. To me, that's really reprehensible. One of the other projects on their list, as a World Bank kind of gotcha, like how dare they give money, was for a fertilizer factory in Bangladesh that is designed to get 3 times as much fertilizer from the same amount of natural gas as the old plants that are now dormant. This is in a time when we're facing high energy prices, high gas prices, high food prices, when food insecurity is spreading rapidly, when a country like Bangladesh has millions of rice farmers who need urea tablets to put in their rice fields. And to say that how dare they finance that because there's a fossil fuel involved is immoral. So yes, on that point from Alex.